Hey, welcome back to a special bonus episode on pet health. Interconnected has been such a big subject, and a lot of people are asking, "Hey, what about my pets? What about the dogs, cats, horses, everything I got going around?" So, I have an expert on microbiome pet health with me today, Dr. Rob Franklin. Welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me, Pedram.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Look, pets are part of the family, and pets are mammals, and pets also have microbiome and microbiota issues and solutions. I've been actually dealing with that for one of my Labradors currently. Changed her diet, and things are better, right? And so it's a big deal. And they, frankly, in my assessment, they almost respond quicker than we do. So yeah, let me just get into your background and kind of how you got into being a microbiome doctor for all this, and then we'll jump in.
Sure. Well, I'm a A&M graduate, so Texas Aggie, and finished veterinary school about 20 years ago. And after veterinary school, did a bit more of the advanced training than most veterinarians, and so I went on did internship and residency, and specialized in internal medicine, and have been practicing on horses and dogs and cats, and own 4 different small animal clinics and 3 different equine clinics, and enjoy practicing. You know, the microbiome is not something that is largely discussed in veterinary school. We were taught about disease and about managing disease, but going back and peeling the onion and figuring out why the disease even started is sometimes, not the thing that is didactically taught to us. I'm sure your training is perhaps a little bit different, but in terms of the Western training, looking at problems holistically, and all the different factors that cause disease, we're not necessarily trained that. So during my clinical work, I ran into a lot of problems, and horses and dogs and cats have bad GI problems, and we're left to try to treat those with antibiotics and try to adjust the disease outcome, but not really understanding why that whole episode started in the first place. So about 15 years ago, I started looking at this more critically and saying, okay, there's got to be something we can do other than just giving a horse antibiotics or a dog antibiotics that has a case of diarrhea. What does the scientific literature tell us? And that's where people were really starting to look at probiotics a bit more critically. They've always been on the market, but no one's really understood that microbiome. That wasn't even part of our medical vernacular 15 years ago. And as we started doing more and more clinical trials and looking at these probiotics and saying, okay, look at all the different effects they have. Look at the upstream, downstream effects. What's happening in here is just there's a whole nother universe that's being discovered. It's like we got a new lens for our telescopes whenever we were starting to look at these intestinal tract and all the bacteria and fungus and viruses that live in there. And it started to change the way that we practiced. And so we started to find a lot of value in the microbiome and trying to adjust that and protect that in order to preserve health and wellness.
Yep. Are there any fundamental differences? I mean, mammals are mammals, but I mean, there's a lot more complexity with different species. So what are the kind of the major differences between them and humans?
Yeah, I think that, you can probably just categorize things as far as omnivores, which, we forage well on plants and on meat. And then the herbivores, the types of herbivore GI tracts that we deal with would be a ruminant, which would be like a cow, and where they're going to have all their fermentation take place in the first part of their intestinal tract, or a hindgut fermenter, which is like a horse or a rabbit, where they go through enzymatic normal digestion on the upper part of their intestinal tract, and the lower part is where they do all the fermenting and extract the nutrients of complex carbohydrates and high fibrous foods. So if we just think about herbivores, that's different in the way that we are. Many of us are vegetarians, and so we do optimize the herbivore aspect of our GI tract. But when we're dealing with a canine or a feline, those are more of a carnivorous type of animal, although they can do well on plant-based diets as well. But those animals, the way that they are put together is a little bit different than people. But since we are a blend as omnivores, there's more similarities, I think, Pedram, in the GI tracts of domesticated animals and humans than there are differences.
Well, so if you look at the evolutionary diet of some of these animals, and so, like my dog's ancestors 100,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, didn't matter, never knew what kibble was, right? It was, a dog would eat a rabbit, a dog would eat a rat, or something like that. So let's talk about what that looks like in terms of the overall makeup of what this animal is ingesting versus the kind of, the mono kibble or whatever it is that they're just used to getting today.
Sure, sure. Well, I think that if we just look at where these animals came from, they all came from the wolf. And so the wolf was a pack animal that would hunt both small and large mammals. They were opportunistic. They weren't afraid to feed off of dead animals either. But, mostly they're attacking and they're eating a whole animal. And whether that be a deer or a rabbit, they're going to go in there and they're going to get a piece of all of it. And that's where, however many years later, we're trying to make a kibble and we're trying to make it a piece of all of it. So that animal they're going to get brain tissue, which is going to be high in omegas, right? They're going to get muscle, it's going to be high in their protein. They're going to get bone to get their mineral. They're going to be having blood to get certain minerals. They're going to get part of the gastrointestinal tract. So they eat that GI tract. They eat the microbes that are within it. So they're getting a natural dose of probiotic. They eat that pancreas and that liver, which have the gallbladder that have the enzymes they need to break down all that stuff. So when they eat that whole animal is almost engineered to digest itself whenever it's put together. And that's the part where they all started. I think as we began to domesticate animals, they began to hunt, but when they were living with early man and in the camp, they would eat essentially what man was eating, the leftovers, whatever they could either steal or was fed to them. So they started to eat things that were cooked. They started to eat plants and meat because the hunter and gatherers were having some of that, and they would feed the dogs anything that was left over. So they started to be a little bit more opportunistic in eating with man, but they would still go out and hunt. So there was certainly a change there, but it never, and I think even to this day, and you and I talked about this a little bit, I don't think that things have changed in where their gut has evolved and where it's all of a sudden meant to live on a kibble. It's still meant to live off of that whole animal diet and getting all those bits and pieces from that animal. And I think they still do very well that way.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a completely different species, which is the challenge. I remember I did a bunch of wilderness survival work in Africa, and we were looking at a lioness eating prey. And so now this is the ancestor of the feline cat, right? And so, just in there in the gut, and you could just see her chomping down on these grasses that this antelope had. So it's like these pre-digested grasses with all of the bacterial. And so I'm looking at this thinking, wow, that is, first of all, it's disgusting for us because that's not how we consume, right? But it's like, look at all the bacteria, look at the probiotics, look at the fermentation that my animals have not seen. I mean, now we give them probiotics and stuff like that, but they've just never seen that in their diet.
Right. Yeah, it is neat, and even thinking about the way that the horse is evolved as well as a wild animal that has been domesticated, and that animal was a grazing animal meant to graze 20 hours a day, eating small amounts frequently, and now we've taken that animal and over time we've had to utilize that animal to help us work and develop the world that we live in. Really happened on the back of the horse, travel, everything. But when that happened, we had to start feeding that horse in a couple of meals instead of just allowing it to graze because it was working throughout the day. It had to eat before work and after work, and so that was different. We needed to begin to feed it higher energy foods, and that's not part of a normal diet for a horse. So, and even in today, even though a lot of these horses are not working, they're more used for pleasure, they still are living in urban environments where they can't go out and graze and do things naturally. So their GI tract has, like the dogs, has not changed. It has not evolved into a grain optimized GI tract. It's still optimized for foraging for long periods of time. And I think that we just have to remember that, let's boil things back to their origin, and let's figure out what works on these animals, and so that we can try to optimize that, and we can try to swim with that current however possible.
So when you see a horse that is, stable horse that's in an urban environment versus one that's allowed to be out to pasture, what do you see? Do you see some of the kind of similar GI issues that we're seeing, like say in human adults with, dysentery and or gas or whatever it would be?
Totally. I mean, and it's amazing how similar it is between the veterinary species. Whether you're talking about a cow in a feedlot or a dairy, you're talking about a horse in a racing stable, you're talking about a dog in an apartment in New York City. They're all really so far away from their natural environment, and their problems are all very similar. They're all dealing with a lot of inflammation in the way that they're fed. Just because the way we're trying to feed them, the diets tend to be very, very inflammatory. We're dealing with a lot of GI issues, whether that be diarrhea, gas. For horses, it's colic or abdominal pain. We see the same thing with small animals and with large animals. We also see a lot of things that aren't directly related to the digestive tract, but yet are precipitated by disturbances in the digestive tract, mostly because of the way that we're feeding the animals. And some of these are autoimmune diseases. I think it's probably the same for some of your patients. We see with dermatological issues that are related to diet and disruptions in the microbiome. So it can be a whole host of things that all have a common origin of the way that we feed them.
Do you see cows? Do you have any bovine patients? Because that's I don't know. I'm sure you've trained in it, but it's a specialty. Yeah.
Yeah, part of my residency was dealing with the food animal, but I never pursued that clinical path.
So I get a question. If we're dealing with cows that are in feedlots, and cows are supposed to be grazing grasses as well, and you're talking about earlier that these are ruminant animals, right? And so, they got to pre-digest this thing. It does what it does and then kind of moves down the track. If you've circumvented that, and let's just say you're even giving this cow the healthiest, most organic, whatever feed you can find, you're still short-circuiting a part of that pathway and that circuitry, and the postbiotic environment of that cow is nothing like a normal cow, is it?
Correct.
Yeah, and maybe that has a lot to do with some of these issues that humans are having who consume those cows.
That's right. I mean, everything's rate of gain when we're dealing with either a milk cow or a beef cow. How much milk can you get out of that animal per day? How much muscle can a feedlot steer grow in a day? And that's, they're trying to feed those animals to get that output, but it's not necessarily, the natural way is a much slower, it's a much better way, but it's a much slower way. And so people don't want to pay for that organic grass-fed meat. Most people want to, the mass populace wants to buy things inexpensively. And so that's why they get that product.
Yeah, get what you pay for.
Okay.
All right, so I guess the big question here is we'll start with the first one, which is supplements. Supplemental probiotics. Have you seen any efficacy there? Have they been helpful to the dogs, cats, and horses that you deal with?
Absolutely. I think that when I talk to my clients and dealing with patients, if they are in for example, a horse that's out on a pasture, ranging here in Texas, do they need to be on a probiotic? No. Do they have a healthy GI tract? Yes. Anytime we change that animal from what you and I have discussed as being the origin, the way that they were set up, anytime we change that, we have to come in there and we have to provide them with some help to be able to digest this modern diet that they're being fed. So we know that, as we discussed, the scientific evidence is now there that probiotics work. We know that certain strains are very important and they do have beneficial roles. And we know that that whenever animals get sick, that these probiotics can help get them back to a healthy GI tract. I use them in both situations, but I always encourage people, this is a way to prevent illness. I don't like waiting for illness to occur and then thinking, let's maybe consider a probiotic. I think you're kind of missing the boat there.
Yeah, it's a day late and a dollar short. Specific strains, I'm assuming they would be, different by, per species type of thing. Anything that you can kind of blanket recommend?
Yeah, it's interesting. There are some, when we do these microbiome studies, we can see that all animals have a little bit different population. But what I think is at least the paradigm that I live in is I'm not necessarily trying to go in and replenish what that animal is missing, because even though you and I are the same species, our microbiomes are very different. They're dependent on our diet, our environment, and our genetics. So it's not a one size fits all. Hey, you're low in XYZ, so I'm going to feed you XYZ to get that number back up. The way that I approach it is trying to find a very commonly used amongst many species probiotic, and in particular strain that I believe in the most is a yeast strain called Saccharomyces boulardii. And Saccharomyces boulardii works well in people, works well in cattle, it works well in horses, works well in dogs and cats. And the reason is it's not trying to replace something that's missing. It's trying to go in there and reestablish a normal environment so that the body can heal itself. The body is an incredible healer. We were created with the ability to regenerate much of our body, whether it's our skin, our liver, or our gut microbiome. It can restore itself if it's put back into the right situation. And I believe that this particular strain of probiotic allows that microflora to expand, the good microflora to expand, and it keeps the pathogenic bacteria, viruses at bay, and so they don't overpopulate. So I'm a big fan of the paradigm of, hey, let's try to equalize, let's try to create a safe environment for the microbiome to expand normally versus trying to figure out what's missing and go in and individually. Because let's face it, there are thousands of strains of different bacteria that are out there, and we just can't get a certain cocktail that is going to be a one size fits all and really be able to make a blanket product that works well.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest challenge with the supplement industry, making promises, right? I mean, the more we learn, the more we're realizing how unique our individual signatures are and our needs, for genetics and all of it. So, but Saccharomyces, so it's interesting that the Saccharomyces boulardii goes across the board for all these species, including us. I mean, a lot of our, human health experts have also spoken of, the benefits of this yeast strain, which kind of help crowd out bad bacteria and also, candida in a lot of ways.
Absolutely.
So that said, if I had a human patient in front of me, I would also say, okay, but you got to chill out on the sugars, right? And so what, in terms of diet for these animals, what are you recommending in terms of kibble? What are you recommending in terms of supplemental food? And could you even do that across the board, or is it individual?
I think you have to look at a little bit lifestyle in terms of where these dogs are in their age, where they are in their mobility. What are they, working dogs? Or are they pleasure dogs? Are they lap dogs? City dogs, country dogs? All those things are going to have a little bit different needs, perhaps. I think in terms of supplements, it's almost a blanket statement that the GI supplement is going to be necessary on all these animals that are left to deal with a modern diet. Unfortunately, probiotics I love the fact that they're becoming more well known, but I think that they get a lot of label dressing on the veterinary side or the animal health side. So you'll get a dog food that will, say contains probiotics. Well, all dog food has to be steamed to a certain level to kill salmonella so that dogs don't get salmonella from eating their dog food. That kills the probiotics in there. So that is a label dressing. They'll put 12 strains of different inexpensive, unclinically proven probiotics on the label, let people believe that they're doing the right thing by their dog, and they're not, because nothing's, there's no test that they have to go through to say, yes, this is actually how much is going to be in the kibble after it's been prepared. They just say, this is what we put in there. So I think that a probiotic supplement is necessary for all dogs that are fed a modern day diet. I think that dogs that are senior dogs or athletic dogs, need a joint supplement as well. These dogs are living because of the ability for us to care for them for better. Our veterinary medicine has gotten better. We're able to prevent a lot of parasites and infections that commonly kill dogs. So their life is getting longer. So their body parts that tend to wear out from age need some help. So I do believe that joint supplements is a big thing for quality of life on dogs and even cats as they, and again, it's like the probiotics start early because you don't want to wait until their 12-year-old, your 12-year-old lab is really limping because its hips are bad. You need to be feeding that throughout the dog's life so that those joints are very protected. So I think the gut and the joint is the big deal. And then I think everything else really can be managed with a proper diet. I think the horse is the same way. The horses, the gut has to be looked after. We're not feeding these horses normally when we're feeding them in an urban environment or in a performance environment. They're not out there grazing 20 hours a day. So we do need to come in there and provide them a GI supplement. I think a joint supplement is, most of these horses that are performance horses, they're getting used hard. So we need to protect those just like your athlete patients. You want to be mindful of that. And then I think, both on the small animal and the large animal, then we're looking at diets that are going to be processed in some way. And so they're a necessary evil. We have to feed them. People try raw diets. They're going in there. They're cooking these foods at home. They're going to the butcher and buying a piece of bone and a hunk of meat. Unfortunately, those are pretty hard to do. I mean, number one, they can be very time consuming and some people can't stick with them. But number two, you've got to try to get that whole rabbit, that whole deer into a meal. And, feeding a hunk of meat and a piece of bone doesn't equal a healthy dog. People think that that's the case and it's not. Same way with a horse, you can't just dump them 10 pounds of corn and a couple of flakes of hay and expect that horse to be healthy. So we have to look at these things and say, okay, what is it we can do that is as simple, because we know simple things create habits that are going to stick, yet is beneficial. I say number one is what you said before, you get what you pay for. You get what you pay for when it comes to buying dog food or horse food. Without a doubt, there's good stuff out there. Think of the same way when you go grocery shopping. I would assume you're probably looking for organic, minimally processed foods with simple ingredients that you can pronounce the names of. They're whole foods. So a lot of our dog foods that are really good contain whole foods. They're containing, salmon. They're containing an entire pea, an entire carrot, an entire potato. Those things are good. When we start seeing lots of scientific chemical names and things, obviously avoid that. Try to get your ingredient list down. People get confused with, I'm sure your clients get confused looking at ingredient labels. My clients do too. They're looking at these dog food labels and going, I don't know. I mean, the only thing that's guaranteed on there is the amount of protein, fat, and carbohydrate in there, but everything else, they're left to ask for my advice. And so that's where I try to advise them, Pedram, is I try to get them to go in there and look for whole foods. You want to look to avoid a lot of meal, which is just byproducts crushed up. And we want to look to avoid a lot of chemicals. And we want to find short lists of things that we know are healthy. Now, if they add vitamins, they're adding minerals, so dicalcium phosphate's added. That's a chemical name, but those are mineral ingredients that are necessary. That's like your bone ingredient. So those are important. Don't be scared away from those. Don't be scared away from added vitamins. Added probiotics are a waste of time. They're not going to survive the kibble process, so don't do that. And don't feed rapidly fermented grains. So just like you were talking about avoiding sugar for your patients, we know how inflammatory those carbohydrates, that rapidly fermented or digestible carbohydrates, they're so bad for inflammation. And veterinary species are the same way. We deal with lots of joint pain that we don't need to deal with if people would quit feeding all these high grain diets to their dogs and to their horses. Because you'll see a young animal whose joints look like that they're 15 years old, a dog that's only 5. And it's because it's living every day in a high inflammatory diet. It's not getting any anti-inflammatory omega-3s in its diet. The omega profiles are way thrown off, too many 6s and 9s, not enough 3s. And then they've got all this grain in their diet, and it just makes their skin itch and makes their joints hurt, causes autoimmune problems, respiratory problems, and we see it in all veterinary species. I'm guessing much like you do.
Oh yeah, you see it in people all over the place. I mean, it's the basis of all this autoimmune issues, that leaky gut, and all the things that we know about, we learned about in the series. Question for you: I'm sure someone's done this study. So if a dog eats a rabbit or a deer or whatever that is, what is in the deer liver? What is in the gallbladder or the bile acids of the rabbit that someone has tried to analyze to say, man, this needs to be in the kibble as well? Like, I mean, it just seems like there's all these ingredients in a very complex, diet that, if you eat what you can get, then, today you got a rabbit, tomorrow you got a mouse, you fast for 3 days, it's like good luck approximating that. But what's happening in the kibble industry to help at least move in that direction?
Right. Well, that's really good. And that's probably another thing that whenever I talk about digestive supplements and the digestive supplement that I prepared is one that also deals with enzymes, because you're right. You eat the whole animal, a small mammal like a rodent or something, you're going to get all that. But a pack of coyotes here in Texas, they kill a deer. Today, one coyote may get a piece of that liver, gallbladder, pancreas. Tomorrow he may just be back on the gluteal muscle, and not get any of that. So it can vary. I think that brings up a great point. They need those enzymes to break down the food. The dog can only make so much in its gallbladder and its pancreas. And so we add in those enzymes, and those enzymes are going to help them break down the fats, the proteins, and the sugars, and in a way that they're not going to get on a typical kibble. So that's something that people are looking at. I think the probiotics also help them digest the food better. And then I think just trying to go with things that are truly easy digestible, having the pumpkin in the diet, the chicory root, things like that do help regulate transit time. You don't want these diets going right through the animal. You want to have good fiber amounts in there. Those are the things where we're looking holistically at the diet, and we're not just trying to say, okay, we need some protein, some fat, some carbohydrate, throw it in a kibble and go. And so people are doing better, the dog food manufacturers, but it's an 80-20 rule. 80% of it is trash, but the average consumer is looking for something that's inexpensive and that, has a cute name, a cute picture on it, maybe has some label dressing on some of the things that we've talked about that are really important, but they're not going to get out of kibble. And that's where I think you've got to go in with a supplement, and you've got to supplement the GI tract and supplement the joint. The joint gets a lot of press. People are these dog foods, horse foods, trying to put things like glucosamine and stuff like that into them. They're not putting enough. It's getting broken down through the steam or the pellet or the kibble process. It's not an effective way to provide joint. If you want to help a dog's joint when you're feeding it its kibble, feed one that's not inflammatory. Feed one that has a good omega-3 to omega-6 profile. Feed one that's got low grain in it. And that's going to help. All my labs that come and see us, I change their diet. I start them on an anti-inflammatory. Within 30 days, they're off the anti-inflammatory. And they're on a joint supplement and with a diet change, and they have a whole new quality of life. The same goes with the horses. But unless you change that diet, you can't add enough anti-inflammatory pills, like an ibuprofen type of pill that we have for these animals, and you can't add enough joint supplement to undo it. You're chasing your tail. You never get anywhere.
Anything cat specific? I know there's a lot of cat owners that are watching this saying, you guys are talking about dogs a lot. And, selfishly, I'm sorry, I got dogs. But, is there anything different about cats that we need to have in mind here?
Well, yes and no. The first is that, yes, cats, when they have a problem, especially an indoor cat, you know about it. All these other animals are defecating outside. A cat's not. So their problems are big time, and they're painful to the people. Their quality of life goes down. The smell can be terrible. The cleanup can be terrible. So it becomes a big issue for cats. Do they suffer from the same problems? Absolutely. Everything we've talked about applies to the cat as well. The quality of the food, their diets are no different than the dogs. They're going to eat that small mammal, typically, or in the bigger cats like you saw in Africa. I mean, they're going to eat the bigger prey, but it's all the same. It's all the same. You're right. We don't give them as much press, but the problems are just as important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, look, they're having processed food coming out of tin cans, and trusting that some company somewhere is looking out for the best interest of their loved one, right? And that's the biggest challenge. Are there any kind of brand record? I mean, I don't like to plug brands here, but any particular brands that you have kind of a better record with that maybe people can look at?
Yeah, that's a common thing, and I get hesitant to make those recommendations for probably the same reasons you do. But I would say as an overall arching statement, again, look for things that are not low cost. You spend a little, you're not going to get very much. So spend the right money, but look at those key bullet points that I mentioned before. I think that a lot of people shop at Walmart, and Walmart, we all hate Walmart, but it becomes a necessary evil in my clients because that's where they're shopping. So I need to tell them something that they can buy there. There's a relatively good brand there called Pure Balance that I have a lot of my clients feeding. If they shop at Walmart, we have a Texas grocer here that has a dog food called Heritage that has some good versions of it. Again, I'm looking a lot at the salmon as a good protein source for dogs. Because the omega-3 profiles, it really helps with the dermatological issues, helps with the inflammation. I'm looking at using potato, pea proteins, carrot, things like that, pumpkin. Those are good plant sources that have good fiber content, good nutritional quality. We have a company called Full Bucket that myself and another veterinarian has developed. We make a specific dog probiotics and specific cat probiotics that are enzyme probiotic and prebiotic containing. So, I would certainly make that recommendation, have people look at that as well at fullbucket.org. But, I know we're not here to plug any brands, but here to really educate people on making good decisions so that they're caring for their pets the best they can. And to me, it all starts with what goes in that animal's mouth. And I truly believe that is the source of wellness for these animals and for us as individual humans.
Amen. Yeah. And look, it's just hard to know who to trust. So in adult humans, we're talking about inulin, we're talking about, undigestible fiber, we're talking about, color charts and, getting all sorts of vegetable content in there. What would be a microbiome friendly diet for dogs, cats, and horses? I mean, let's just put horses as herbivores over to the side for a second and just go for the omnivores first.
Mm-hmm. I don't think that you have to say it's got to be all meat or all plant to have a healthy microbiome. I think that, again, going with whole food as much as possible is going to be good. And then as far as trying to protect that microbiome, I think you've just got to add that probiotic. I think Aspergillardia is a great everyday probiotic. I take it myself. I feed it to my horses. I feed it to my small animal patients. I think that is the X factor in keeping the microbiome really regulated, preventing overgrowth, whether it be a candida yeast type of overgrowth, or we see a lot of times the acid levels in the gut go way up because they're feeding a lot of grain. It helps keep those acid producing bacteria in check. So I think that the key is feed whole food, plant-based, and single protein meats to our omnivores, and then to provide the supplemental probiotic. I just don't think there's any way to not do that combination and to do the best thing.
Well, that's a challenge of the world we live in, right? Or just let them run around the field and go grab a rabbit, but good luck with that, My dogs are just, they grew up in a house, right? They're just, those days are over, right? Like that's not happening. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not happening. So one thing that I keep hearing about, and I don't know how much of it is hype, how much of it is real, is, what about the arsenic levels in this kibble? So a lot of people are talking about kind of the toxicity and the polluted ingredients that are making it into some of these dog foods. Are you seeing that?
It's out there for sure. And in the cheaper diets are going to be, guilty of all those sins that are being broadcast. And a lot of it's being broadcast by, the more the boutique diets, and they're getting together and trying to, point out, the deficiencies. I always caution people to not, be scared and where they just say, I can't, but there's not a safe kibble out there. There's not a safe, because they are. I mean, let's face it, we don't deal with a lot of toxic exposures to dogs. We do see whenever they are fed cheap diets, you'll see an older dog whose liver enzymes are creeping up. And I think that's because they are having to kind of detox themselves from some of these, less friendly diets. But I think that if you go with some of the good dietary recommendations that we've mentioned here, you're going to segment yourself out of that market where you have those fears. And getting back to your point, you were talking about inulin, and you were asking about supporting that microbiome, and that's something I haven't mentioned a lot, but it sort of comes part and parcel with me. But anytime you do a probiotic, the prebiotic or the inulin type of ingredient is key. I mean, you've got to give substrate for those healthy bacteria to feed on. You've got to give an anchor for the probiotics to go through as well. So that prebiotic is crucial in the veterinary species. There's many types. We use a lot of mannan oligosaccharides, or MOS, but there's XOS, FOS, inulin. All those are good prebiotics, and they're good for all species, whether it's an herbivore or a carnivore or omnivore.
Great to know. Great to know. Dr. Rob Franklin, thank you so much. This has been great. I mean, this is, everyone talks about human health, but, you got all these critters living in our houses with us, and we love them just as much. So it's important for us to live probiotically with them as well. Thanks for the work that you're doing. And if you have any other resources, I'm happy to take them and share them with our audience as we get through this.
Cool. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.